Okay, zullen we gaan starten? All right, welcome everyone. Happy to see so many people here in the auditorium, but also there must be more than 100 people online, which is a bit strange, of course, not to see people, but they see us. So also welcome the people online. Today we have a very special guest. It's the new director of the Rembrandt Association, who started in the 1st of July this year, 2022. He followed Fusine Bijl de Vriel, who did it for 22 years, the job, so it's quite a responsibility. Before working in the Rembrandt Association, Geert-Jan Janse worked in the Tailors Museum, where he was responsible for research and policy. Then went abroad, working in Beijing, Paris, to become the secretary of the Dutch Collection Committee, kind of an institute to protect important cultural heritage here in the Netherlands. Geert-Jan, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan, for the introduction. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here tonight on the Rembrandt Association, or Vereniging Rembrandt, as it is called in Dutch. I want to tell you something tonight about our history, the history of the Rembrandt Association, why we were founded, and what our contribution has been to Dutch public collections. I am going to speak in English most of the time, but this first slide shows a quote, a saying we often use at the association. Niets is er zomaar. It's difficult to translate, but it means something as nothing is self-evident or should be taken for granted. And of course that's something that is true for many aspects in life, but it is also specifically true for what we can see today in Dutch museums. This is a picture of 4 very famous paintings by Vermeer in the Gallery of Honor at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And what we see today in Dutch museums has never been, is not the result of a preconceived plan. It is the result of a very capricious historical process of which the outcome was never certain. So it is a story of successes, but it's also a story of missed opportunities. And most of what we see today in the Dutch museums previously was part of private collections. And compared to other countries, compared to Germany or to France, the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, has a very specific history, collecting history, because we never had a very strong or continuous tradition of royal or noble collections. And what was very typical for the Dutch Republic was that art was collected by all classes in society. So there were a lot of private collections, and at the same time, art was also always seen as a commodity. So as something to be sold and to trade in. There were already in the 18th century famous auctions in Amsterdam and The Hague, and many Dutch artworks spread around Europe after being sold at one of these auctions. And I wanted to start with this picture because all Vermeer paintings in the collection of the Rijksmuseum are there because of private collectors. For instance, this painting, Woman Reading a Letter, was for a long time part of a collection of an Amsterdam banker, Van der Hoop. And in 1854, it was bequeathed to the city of Amsterdam, but the council initially was not very positive because they did not want to pay the inheritance tax. So fortunately, there were some private individuals in Amsterdam who stepped in, who paid for the inheritance tax. And so this collection, this important collection of Van der Hoop, was preserved for Amsterdam. Not only this famous painting, but for instance also Rembrandt's Jewish Bride was also part of this collection. The Love Letter by Johannes Vermeer, painting was acquired in 1892 from a private Amsterdam collection with support of the Vereniging Rembrandt, the Rembrandt Association. The Milkmaid, again acquired from an old Amsterdam collection in 1908, and again with support of the association. And this painting, View of Houses in Delft, known as the Little Street, was bequeathed to the museum in 1921. Part of what happened with these private collections is that from roughly 1850 onwards, there was an enormous exodus of collections being sold, collections who often, after being sold at auction, left the Netherlands forever. A famous example is the private collection of King William II, who you see here in a portrait by Jan Adam Kruseman. After his death, his collection was sold at auction because there was a significant debt, but his collection contained paintings by very famous international artists such as Bellini, Rubens, Van Dyck, Perugino, Guercino. Not one of these paintings was acquired by the Dutch state at that point. And it are all artists that afterwards have never been present in Dutch collections, or at least not at the level they were represented in his collection. In the 1850s and afterwards, the Dutch government really was of the opinion, the famous saying by the Dutch liberal statesman Johan Rudolf Thorbecke, often seen as the founding father of Dutch democracy, that government is no judge of art and should conduct a policy of neutrality in this field, which also meant no acquisitions for public collections. To show you a few examples of the Dutch masterpieces previously in the collection of King William II and sold at auction in 1850, for example, this Annunciation by Jan van Eyck, which ended up in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where it can still be seen today, and also this fabulous portrait of Rembrandt, portrait of Nicolaas Ruts, which ended up in the Frick collection in New York. From the 1870s onwards, a lot of private collections, mainly private collections in Amsterdam, came to the market. In Amsterdam, it was a success to preserve the collection van der Hoop for Amsterdam, but a similar attempt in the city of Rotterdam failed miserably. Collection Vis Blokhuizen, who in 1869 was bequeathed to the city, but refused by the council, again because they did not want to pay the inheritance tax. Entire collection was sold at auction, among which this painting, the Lace Maker by Vermeer, and it was acquired by the Louvre for 3,600 guilders at the time. Not only paintings left the Netherlands in this period, but also architectural elements. And a famous example is this root screen, I think is the term in English, from St. Jan's Cathedral in Den Bosch by Hendrik de Keyser, which in 1866 was demolished and sold, and since 1871 on view at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where it can still be seen today. And perhaps the most famous example, these two portraits by Rembrandt, Martin and Opium, who were part of a very famous Amsterdam collection van Loon van Winter, collection that was also on view in Amsterdam. So in many aspects was seen as a public collection at the time. But in 1878, the entire collection was sold to the Rothschild family, and these paintings left Amsterdam, left the Netherlands, and in 2016 were acquired by the Dutch state and the Republic of France, and are now on view either at the Rijksmuseum or the Louvre in Paris. So against this background of all these private collections being sold off and disappearing to collections abroad, some people felt the need for action. And this is especially true for someone who we owe a great deal of gratitude to, Victor de Steurs. He is the small, rather small man you see on the left, and the other man sitting on the chair is Pierre Cuypers, the architect. And very often when they are pictured together, Victor de Steurs is pictured standing because he was a rather small man and Pierre Cuypers was a very large man. He wrote a very famous article, comment mainly, on this cultural policy or lack of cultural policy in the Netherlands, called Holland op zijn smalst, which was published in the Gids in 1873. And he wrote, and I'm going to quote this in Dutch, on the screen now on view at the V&A in London. Ik kon bijna niet geloven, when he was in London to visit this museum, dat hetgeen ik zag in werkelijkheid voor mij stond. He felt humiliated, and he also was afraid that someone would come up to him and ask him if he was a Dutchman. At the time, and this is very important to realize, Dutch museums had no budget whatsoever. Around this time, the annual budget of the Mauritshuis, for example, was 800 guilders. And it could only be used for maintenance of the collection and not for acquisition. Victor de Steurs and a group of Amsterdam collectors, private collectors, art lovers, united themselves in 1883 to preserve treasures, national treasures for the Netherlands. And they founded what they call the Vereniging tot Behoud in Nederland van Kunstschatten Rembrandt. They chose Rembrandt because it was, of course, a very nationalist idea that he was the biggest and most important Dutch artist who had ever lived. And in their opinion, and again, this is, of course, a very 19th century idea, but in their opinion, he was also a sort of objective benchmark for quality. So what better name than Rembrandt for such a new association? In the early days of the association, the main focus was preservation and return, preservation of art treasures in the Netherlands, preserve them for Dutch public collections, and return of important paintings who had already left the country. And the specific and concrete reason why these Amsterdam collectors, art lovers, united themselves was the auction of a very famous collection of drawings by Jacob de Vos. You see him depicted here in a portrait by Nicolaas Pieneman at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, a collector who had amassed a collection of 1,300 sheets of old master drawings, many dozens of Rembrandt drawings, and his collection again was being sold at auction. The association, the newly founded association, made available a budget of 50,000 guilders to acquire works of art, drawings at this auction. And again, if you compare 50,000 guilders to the 800 guilders as annual budget in more or less the same period of the Mauritshuis, you get an idea of the sort of enormous scale of what was going on here. And with this 50,000 guilders, it was possible to acquire 200 lots at this auction. They were all made available to the Rijksprentenkabinet, the Rijksmuseum. And many of those sheets are still considered masterpieces and very crucial central sheets in this collection. And it's very interesting to see that the lot numbers they wanted to buy were all, to a large extent, there was a very, again, nationalist approach to what they thought was very important to preserve at this point for the Netherlands. So were pieces, drawings, who had a particular relation to Dutch history, for instance, and drawings who had a more purely artistic quality were much cheaper also at this auction. This is a famous drawing by Rembrandt, part of that collection, and to show you also one of those more artistic drawings, which drawings are now appreciated enormously also because of their quality. This beautiful drawing by Hendrik Goltzius of a monkey was relatively cheap at that auction because there was no connection to Dutch history. It was a purely artistic drawing. Shortly afterwards, and this is one of the Vermeer paintings I started my story with, there was another auction in Amsterdam, and this Vermeer came to the market. It was acquired with support of this newly founded association. They paid 41,000 guilders, but the permanent threat was this was acquired. Collection van Loon, the two Martin and Opje portraits, had been sold. What would happen if the most famous collection in Amsterdam, the collection 6, would also be auctioned? So this was the permanent threat at that time. The association had to be ready, had to accumulate funds to be prepared for a possible auction of the collection 6. To show you an example of the variety of objects that were supported in this early period by the association, this is a reliquary bust. It's actually the first important medieval object that was acquired for a Dutch public collection. It is a bust that was for a very long time a relic in one of the churches at Utrecht. It had survived the Reformation, and it ended up somewhere at a dealer, antique dealer in Paris, where it was spotted by Victor de Steurs. And as some of you might know, Victor de Steurs was not only very interested in medieval art, but also felt strongly connected to our Catholic past, to the Catholic heritage of the Netherlands. So this was the kind of object he simply could not resist. So it was supported by the association and can now be seen at the Rijksmuseum. This is a landscape by Rembrandt. Rembrandt did not paint a lot of landscapes, and it is actually the first painting by Rembrandt that was acquired by the Rijksmuseum, because the 3 paintings by Rembrandt that were on view at the Rijksmuseum in 1885, when the museum opened, were all permanent loans of the city of Amsterdam. This painting was acquired in 1900, again with support of the association, but in this case also support by the Dutch state and support by some private individuals, also, for instance, Abraham Bredius, the famous Rembrandt scholar. The Milkmaid was part of a branch of the collection 6 that ended up by marriages and inheritances in a different part of the family, and in 1905 was for sale, came up for sale. 39 paintings were offered by a member of the Sixth family for the enormous amount of 750,000 guilders. And I show you this again because in 1905 there was a lot of discussion about whether or not to buy this painting. For instance, someone as Frits Lucht, very famous art historian, was very skeptical, very critical. He thought it was too expensive. He thought this was an important painting, but the other 38 were hardly of any importance. So there was a strong debate about whether or not to support this acquisition. It was supported, luckily, I think we can say, looking back, and acquired for the Rijksmuseum. Briefly, to show you that it is not only private collections from Amsterdam coming to the market, but also elsewhere. In The Hague, there was a very famous collection Steengracht, was assembled by the Steengracht van Oostkapelle family over a few generations, and it had been on view, public view, in The Hague since 1823. And again, considered more or less as part of our public art collections. But in 1913, it was brought to auction and auctioned in Paris. This painting was acquired for the Mauritshuis, where it can still be seen today, by Gerard ter Borch, with support of the Rembrandt Association. Same applies to this famous painting by Jan Steen. But not all paintings from this collection were preserved for the Netherlands. This is a painting by Rembrandt, not his best painting, I think. It's Bathsheba, and it was acquired for 1 million francs, which was at the time the world record for an old master. And well, if you take into consideration that only this week, I think, there was a new record for a Mondrian painting of over 50 million, and well, taking into account what you currently have to pay for a work by Rembrandt, it shows that also in that aspect there's been a very long development. It was acquired at this auction by De Wien, a famous art dealer, and relatively soon afterwards bequeathed by an American collector to the Metropolitan Museum, where it can still be seen today. In the early days, the Rembrandt Association supported acquisitions mainly for the Rijksmuseum, but also, as I showed you, for the Mauritshuis. This is an example of a painting by Hieronymus Bos, the Peddler, which came to the market in the 1930s. In a collection in Vienna. And again, this is an example of not only trying to preserve national treasures, but also trying to reacquire them if they come to the market somewhere abroad. So this was acquired for Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam. So from 1920 onwards, there is a different approach, although it is sort of two approaches consisting next to each other for some time. There is the continuous effort to preserve national treasures who come to the market, but there is also a new approach trying to strengthen the Dutch public collections, not only by acquisitions of Dutch art, but also a more international focus. And in this period, 1922, this portrait by Goya, for example, is acquired by the Rijksmuseum and supported by the association. And also, and it's really only from the 1920s, 1930s onwards, Asian art. And this beautiful statue of Shiva Nataraya, which still is one of the masterpieces of the collection of Asian art at the Rijksmuseum, was acquired in 1935 with support of the association. Same applies to this statue of Guan Yin. After World War II, there is a third approach, and basically consists of the long discussion within the association whether or not to support acquisitions of contemporary art. A very early example is this work by Matthijs Maris, which was acquired in 1906 for Museum Boijmans van Beuningen. It was the first example of a more or less contemporary work supported by the association, but was also for a very long time the only example. This painting by Marc Chagall, a very important painting in his oeuvre, was acquired by the Van Abbe Museum in 1951, and it was the first really contemporary support given by the association, and that was something that was also hotly debated. So in the end, the board had to vote on this, and there were 6 votes in favor and 5 against. Again, I'm going to quote something in Dutch. One of the board members at the time said, in de toekomst zou men dit werk van Chagall wel eens als een zeer belangrijke aankoop kunnen beschouwen, ook al zijn thans zeer velen niet geneigd aan deze kunstuiting enige waarde toe te kennen. I think he was not entirely convinced himself, but this discussion took some years because before finally the association decided that it was of great importance also to support contemporary works of art, also from the idea that they could be formative in forming a new modern society. A famous example is this cutout by Henri Matisse at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, but also at the same museum, this work by Barnett Newman. So I wanted to show you now briefly some more recent acquisitions supported by the association, also to illustrate the great range and diversity of works of art supported by the association. This lacquer chest, acquired in 2013 by the Rijksmuseum. This statue by Adriaan de Vries, which very famous Dutch sculptor who up until 2014 was not part of any Dutch public collection with a very significant work. So when this came to auction, it was really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and with generous support of the association, this was acquired by the Rijksmuseum. A beautiful screen here in Leiden at Museum Volkenkunde, which shows the Bay of Nagasaki and the island of Deshima, but also this painting by Constable for Rijksmuseum Twente, 2 flower pyramids for Kunstmuseum De Hague, a beautiful tapestry, I think, is what describes it perhaps best, by El Anatsui for the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, supported in 2020, artist from Ghana. Of course, also the Standard Bearer by Rembrandt, currently on tour through the Netherlands. You can visit and see it now at the Mauritshuis. Acquired by the Dutch state, and very generous support of the association, 15 million euros. It was by far the most significant support ever granted to a single acquisition. But also even more recently, this painting by Miro for the Museum Boijmans in Amsterdam. not only very significant and important acquisitions for large museums, but also smaller acquisitions for often smaller institutions, but equally significant. One example we often show is this carafe by Andries Kopier for the Glasmuseum in Leerdam. So the Rembrandt Association supports acquisitions throughout sort of the entire range, from antiquity to contemporary art for the larger institutions, but also the smaller museums. I think a very interesting example is, recent example is this view of Renen by Jan van Gooyen, which was acquired by the newly founded Stadsmuseum in Renen and supported by the association. So I have shown you something about these different approaches since the founding of the association. First, mainly focused on preservation and return of national treasures, and then from the 1920s onwards, sort of broader approach to trying to strengthen the Dutch public collections, to, after World War II, also a broad support of contemporary art. Now, on a more practical level, I wanted to tell you something about the application process, and I wanted to do that by focusing on this acquisition, again, for a museum here at Leiden, for the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden. This is a ceremonial sword, known as the sword of Ommerschans, and it's a very large sword and dates from around 1500 BC, so it's from the Bronze Age. And for over a century, the museum had wanted to acquire this piece. And in 2017, it came up at auction. So how does this work? I apologize because the text is in Dutch, but it all starts with the museum. So the museum notices this very important object is for sale, comes up for auction, sends in an application for a grant to the association. And this is a very, I mean, this really is they have to supply a lot of information. So that it's not a single sheet of paper. It is a lot of extra information. Then the board of the association asks an independent expert, one or two, to advise on this grant application. Their advice and the application are discussed in a board meeting by the board, and then at these meetings, whenever possible, the works of art are present, so they can be seen in person by the board members and they can discuss about them. During this meeting, the board decides whether or not to support this acquisition, and decides on the amount of support to give to this museum. So in this case, it was a significant amount because it was such an important object, and supported by this grant, the museum could bid at auction and was successful in acquiring this enormous sword for Leiden. Briefly, something about our organizational structure. So the Vereniging Rembrandt really is a foundation. So we have 17,000 members. We have a yearly general meeting of members. We have a board of directors of 12 people, 12 board members, 11 non-executive directors, and 1 executive director, general director. So that's me. The board decides on grants. Then there is a board of advisors, 33 people currently. They advise on art historical matters, also on judicial questions and questions of philanthropy. We also have what we call the bureau, 22 people. That's the daily running of the organization, so finances, marketing, communication, administration. And the sources of income are the yearly contribution of these members, the 17,000 members. We have 10 what we call circles, so groups of members who have united themselves and often contribute significantly more than the normal yearly contribution. We also receive inheritances, and we're very lucky to receive also support of, for instance, the Prins Bernhard Cultuurfonds on a yearly basis since the 1960s, and more recently also from the Vriendenloterij. So we try to strengthen these partnerships as well. Nowadays, it is still support for acquisitions, but also support for research and restoration. Show you two recent examples in this slide, and this is all from the idea that object-based, collection-based research, connoisseurship, is very important and is something that for some time there's been a tendency to approach and to teach art history and history in a more theoretical way. And of course it is of great importance to offer new perspectives on our public collections, on what is included in them and what is missing. There never is only one perspective on our public collections, and they are continuously in development. But we firmly believe that also if you want to tell a new story, it always starts with a very thorough knowledge of the object itself. So that is why, by offering research grants, for instance, we always try to focus and to ask attention for this a vein of more object-based research. Challenges for the future. I think a very important challenge for the kind of association we are is to keep the community spirit alive, the verenigingsgevoel, as we would say in Dutch, passing it on to a next generation. On a more practical level, also supplementing funds after all these very ambitious acquisitions that have been done over the last few years. Another point of interest and actually also concern is the role of government. Here in the Netherlands, the government or the state, the Dutch state, contributes to acquisitions through what is called the Museaal Aankoopfonds. But this is a fund that is not significantly funded and not on a structural basis, which means the role of the Dutch state in acquisitions is limited somewhat. And on the other hand, we try to lobby for fiscal measures to strengthen patronage from private donors. A more fundamental question, and perhaps a good question also for after this talk, is what the future is for collecting for and by Dutch museums. Because, as I've tried to show you also tonight, is that there is actually already so much in Dutch collections. So I think there's also a task and an opportunity to connect these different collections in a better way. For instance, some works of art in a specific collection are never on view, and in another collection would be very interesting for the public as well. So this is something we try to contribute to. My predecessor, Fusine Bijl de Vroe, was also given a fund to specifically for this what we call collectiemobiliteit. So to really look at how you can connect different collections in a better way. And of course, there is always discussion, and wanted to show you this picture of a recent article in NRC by Hans Hartog-Jager. It's as you can see, the works of art he shows are all supported by recent acquisitions, supported by the association. There's a lot you can say about this article. He focuses on some names of contemporary artists who, in his opinion, are worthy of support and neglected. One of those artists, just to give you an example, is Alan Gallagher, who actually is also supported recently. A work of her has been acquired by Fries Museum, and this acquisition was supported by the Rijksmuseum. So just to show you that by using different examples, you can also tell a different story from what he focuses on in his article. But in a more general way, I think it's very, very good that by this kind of articles, it also shows it is a very lively and active discussion we should conduct together on what is the future of collecting for the Netherlands. This I've already shown you. So, to conclude, I've tried to show you something of basically the enormous catching up for Dutch public collections since 1883. What I always find fascinating is to realize that when the Rijksmuseum was opened to the public in 1885, there were only 9 paintings by Rembrandt in Dutch public collections. Nowadays, including the standard bearer, we have 42. Or actually, I think 43 if you count the newly attributed painting in Museum Bredius. So it shows you something of the scale of what has been done since 1883, and also of the role of the Rembrandt Association in this field. I've showed you some of the shifts in emphasis in the history of our association, and I hope I've also shown you something of our current activities of this very broad support for both large and smaller institutions. So we support research, restorations, acquisitions, and we also share expertise, and often try to do that also with our members, and that is something we can never do alone. We really depend on our members, on our different partnerships to continue to support the Dutch public collections. And in this way, we try to make important works of art available to the general public for now and for future generations. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm going to stand here because otherwise I hear myself. Thank you very much, Geert-Jan, for this very promising future site. Actually, if there are questions, please think about it, because I'm gonna ask my first question, and then it's up to you, of course. But this summer, another member of the Rembrandt Association, Hilbert Lootsma, and I were together with students exploring what is the perfect acquisition, and you asked it almost the whole time to everyone. So now we're gonna put the question to you. Me. What for you is the perfect acquisition?
It's a very difficult question for me to answer, because I'm one of the 12 board members, but when it comes to decisions on grants, what to support, I have no voting. I have no vote. So it's a difficult question for me to answer. And I think it is, perhaps the answer is also that it's not necessarily an acquisition. It could also be, as I've tried to point out, in thinking about new ways of connecting existing collections. I think there's also a lot to be done in that respect. But of course, there are always important works of art coming to the market. It can be works that have been previously unknown, but it can also be works of artists that previously been very much underestimated. So, as I've tried to show, I think it's a very crucial notion that our public art collections are there's never one point where you can say this is it, they are concluded. So it's perhaps not the answer you were hoping for, but more general answer.
All right, thank you. Are there questions here? Then I just let you think, because I have already a second question. Where did it, because you showed us in a perfect way the triumphs of the Rembrandt Vereniging, in that way the acquisitions, like the Matisse, that really huge and very important works later onwards, that was proven to be so. But are there also points where it really went wrong, where the Rembrandt Vereniging paid enormous prices for a work of art which is now in the depot and will never ever be out of the depot? And what can we learn from that? Or is it always a bit of trying to get a good work but never be sure if it really resists the time?
I think that is could be, well, perhaps the most famous example in the Netherlands is, of course, the Han van Meegen, Emmausgangers, a painting that fooled a lot of the connoisseurs at the time, and also to some extent the association, because it was also supported, which is, of course, is a warning to always remember that even if everyone seems to agree on a certain work of art, sometimes future generations are of a different opinion. I think the main examples of where we missed out, or Dutch public collections missed out, are these instances where collections came to the market and already at an early stage. For instance, because of the rise of American collectors, it was simply just out of reach for Dutch collections. And I think that is a development that continues more or less up until this day. I mean, there is a beautiful portrait by Beckmann coming to auction in Berlin in a few weeks' time, from his Amsterdam period. But I think the estimate is 30 to 50 million euros. So there is also a segment of the art market that is more or less out of reach for Dutch collections, public collections.
Other questions? Because otherwise I'm the whole time questioning. Could be close to you.
Hi. You very lucidly explained how the origin of the association happened during a context of nationalism, and consequently the supporting and collecting policies were in line with this idea of collecting the Dutch. What would you say is the sense of the contemporary collecting and supporting? I don't want to call it an agenda, but maybe parameters.
Nowadays, now. Well, what is very important to realize is that it is always the museum that does an application for a grant. So it's not the board, not the association. We do not collect ourselves. It is really the museum that does an application. So in that way, I think the kind of grants we get reflects the way museums collect currently. So of course there is a shift over time. if there is an agenda, again, that really is more, I think, a question for the museums, because it is not, I mean, we do not have an agenda in the way that we feel that a specific type of art should be acquired more or less. It's really the museums that apply for a grant, and then this grant is discussed, is also discussed by the board and by these individual experts, independent experts. Of course you see a shift, but this is more a shift in the way Dutch museums collect nowadays.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I would like to, I think, ask a question more or less in the same area.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you take diversity, which is the buzzword at the moment, into account?
Well, again, my first answer is that it is something, it is the museums who apply for grants. So, of course, we see that a different kind of grants are discussed now by the board. Diversity, I think, is very important. Also very important, not only in the kind of acquisitions that are supported, but also for us as an association, because as I tried to indicate, our main aim is to share these works of art with as many people as possible by acquiring them for Dutch public collection. So I think also in that respect, it's very important to have a very good idea of the diversity of the current public. So it is also something that not only applies to acquisitions, but also more broadly to the way you function as an organization and as an association. And in terms of acquisitions, if you look at recent acquisitions, for instance, this work by El Anatsui, for instance, this is a very different kind of work than compared to, I don't know, 15 years ago. So in that way you see the way museums collect nowadays reflected in the kind of grants discussed by the board.
Sorry. I think it was very good how you showed the different focus points in the different policy periods of the association, starting with Dutch art, trying to return Dutch art to the Netherlands, towards a more European approach, particularly European painting, towards a more global, modern, contemporary art approach. You also said the association has 7,000 members now.
17.
17, sorry. Is there a link between the change in policy and the influence of the members? In other words, does the focus of the Rembrandt Association, is it related to the background of the members?
It's a very interesting question. For a very long time, it was at least in the 19th century, it was more or less a sort of private initiative of a small group of Amsterdam collectors, art lovers. And it is really of the past 10, 15 years that the association has also grown enormously in the amount of members we have. I don't think it is something you see reflected in these earlier shifts, because, again, the association was much smaller then. I think it is something you see and could see more nowadays, because a lot of our members are collectors themselves. So we have when I meet our members, for instance, when there is a dinner for one of those circles, very lively discussions on what is collected and what should be supported and what should not be supported. So they feel actively involved with our association, and they also provide input to us. So yes, I think nowadays far more, at least, than in a previous situation, because it was a very small group of people back then.
Yes, so thank you for your talk. You briefly touched upon the rising prices within the art world, and I think maybe we can even speak about certain commercialization within the art world. And your association supports this to a certain extent because you make it possible for museums to pay such often ridiculous prices for artworks nowadays. So I was wondering, where does this end, and how do you feel about this?
Well, where does this end? That's a very good question. I think if someone has the answer, I'd be very interested to discuss that with you. But no, that's a very, I think that's a very good point. And I think it's always a very difficult discussion also for our board, because if you would say, for instance, at a certain point, it simply is too expensive, those prices are ridiculous, we just do not want to be involved with it anymore, it also means that a certain group of works of art are more or less lost for public collections, because it means you cannot acquire them for public collections anymore. So that is always the discussion, and always the question I think board members also ask themselves, well, I mean, is it something that is of such eminent importance that you want to make it available to as many people as possible for now and for future generations? And does that, is this a price you are prepared to pay for that? But I agree that, of course, there is a point at which it becomes nearly impossible also to keep up with the prices and the level of auction prices, for instance.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. Sometimes museums also, ensemble, I don't know if there's an English word for that, but they sell their collections or part or artworks. Has this ever happened to works which are supported with support from your from the association? If not, what would you think about it if that would happen?
It's a very good question again. When the museum receives a grant, it is that there is also a contract they have to sign, and part of that is that this work for which the grant is supplied always has to be part of public art collections. So it even involves if the specific institution at some point would cease to exist, there is the obligation to make sure that this specific work is given or on loan or whatever to a different public collection. So it is something that is really part of the rules of accepting a grant. And it is also something we always keep an eye on. So if there is a threat of a work that's been supported being sold or of a museum disappearing, it is something we really keep a focus on. And we actively also try to find a new place for such a work. Do not hope you're going to correct me now.
No, not at all. I thought just may have an interesting addition. I remember one example of a painting by Hobbema, which was acquired with support of the Rembrandt Association for Mauritshuis in The Hague, and it was given later by the Dutch state as a present to Canada for liberating our country.
That's true.
So that was I think we
That's true.
tried to get some money. I don't know what happened afterwards.
It was decided by the state,
Yeah.
to give it as a sort of gift to the Allied forces. Yeah.
Last question. Thank Thank you very much for the talk. It was nice to get this historical overview. I thought I'd end with a bit of a challenging question, and it's maybe good to know it's after 7, so there's no live stream, there's nothing online anymore.
Yes.
But following from a debate we had here last year, we did a Rembrandt trial with some of the teachers and the students debating the new acquisition of the standard bearer, and there were a lot of different points coming up, but I think one of the aspects we didn't focus on here yet, and that we as teachers didn't really have an answer to, I thought I'd just ask you about it, because one of the things that we discussed is that during this acquisition and the acquisition of Martin and Opien, so 3 really expensive Rembrandt paintings that were acquired, they were all acquired for the Rijksmuseum in recent years, while the director of the Rijksmuseum is one of your board members, and so a lot of students were surprised to hear that, because that appears to be somewhat of a conflict of interest, even though he may very well step out of the particular meeting.
He does, yes.
I was just wondering, as to your personal opinion in that respect, and maybe also more generally speaking, about the pros and cons of having very active museum directors on the board versus maybe people with a bit more distance.
No, that's a very good question. And if you look at the history in sort of early phase, what you see is that a lot of the acquisitions that are supported are actually for the Rijksmuseum, because this was the sort of new national institution, and this was the sort of apex of our national art. So that is something you see a lot in the early phase. Nowadays, you see, of course, a far broader range of acquisitions, not only by the Rijksmuseum, Mauritshuis, but also by smaller museums. So that is, I think, a completely different view, different approach also. In our board, we have a mix of board members, mix of people who either have a art historical background or something completely different. For instance, a more of a political background, or more of a marketing background, for instance. And I think that has always been and is of importance, because it is something that those two, the combination of not only art historical knowledge, but also sort of more broader general knowledge, really adds something. So it is a good mix. I think it is also important to have museum directors on the board, because it gives you a more active connection to what is happening in Dutch museums. And there is a very clear and strong procedure when a grant or an application by a museum of one of the board members is discussed. So there is a procedure for that. If it is, of course, still the case that certain works of art are very much an addition to the collection at the Rijksmuseum, but nowadays far less so than in the early phase. But I think, again, the Van Gooien is a good example. It is a kind of painting that if the Rijksmuseum would do an application for this, it would not be very successful, because it would not be of much added value. But to Rene, it is of much added value. So there's always this discussion. You try to add something to what is in Dutch public collections as a whole, but it also has to be of added value to the collection of the museum itself. And sometimes it is evident that it is the collection of the Rijksmuseum. Sometimes it is evident it is the collection of Rene. So it is always something that is discussed and by case.
All right. Thank you very much for being here, for giving this talk. Thank you very much, every one of you, to be here. And our next one will be about the depot of the Boijmans van Beuningen. So everyone welcome. That's within 2 weeks. Bye-bye.